My name is Paige Tanner. I'm 34 years old, and I learned what my family truly thought of me from a hospital bed. 6 weeks earlier, I had given birth to my daughter Nora. Then, on my way home from a late shift, a truck ran a red light on Colfax. I woke up in the emergency room with 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and my right arm in a cast. My husband, Daniel, was in Seattle, 6 hours away. Someone needed to care for our newborn daughter that night. My mother lived just 20 minutes from the hospital. She said no. She told Daniel one sentence, and it's the reason you're listening to this story today. Your sister never has these kinds of emergencies. My sister was on a Caribbean cruise. My mother was sitting in a casino. What I did from that hospital bed over the next 3 minutes changed the next 9 years. And $486,000. And that wasn't even the part that broke them. The part that broke them walked through my hospital door 3 hours later. An elderly man carrying a worn leather folder. He said something none of my family ever expected to hear out loud. Welcome to Hidden Family Revenge, the channel where quiet people finally settle the account. If someone in your life has ever treated your reliability like a blank check, this story is for you. Leave a comment below and tell me, who showed up when your life fell apart? And if stories like this speak to you, don't forget to subscribe. The story really begins with a phone call. I woke from anesthesia in a curtained emergency room bay. The first things I noticed were the weight of the cast on my right arm and the plastic hospital bracelet wrapped tightly around my left wrist. A nurse was saying my name as though she'd already repeated it several times. Every breath felt like someone had parked a car on my chest. Daniel's phone was on speaker beside my pillow. His voice had that careful, controlled tone he always used when he was terrified but trying not to sound terrified. Paige. The babysitter can't stay past 11. I called your mom. Before he finished the sentence. Already knew. She won't come. There was a brief silence. Behind his voice I heard something unmistakable. The electronic chime of slot machines. The cheerful music casinos play when someone wins. My mother was at Black Hawk with her friends. She told Daniel she couldn't drive over because she had promised to cat sit while my sister Megan was on a Caribbean cruise. Cat. My 6-week-old daughter needed someone for one night. And the answer was a cat. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that because people expect the woman lying in a hospital bed to fall apart. I didn't. Instead, I looked at the hospital bracelet on my wrist. Then, using my left hand, I picked up my phone from the tray beside me. I had things to take care of. I had always been very good at taking care of things. That had always been the problem. To understand what happened next, you need to know who I was before that night. It explains why my family treated me like a faucet that never stopped running. I grew up in a rented duplex in Aurora, where the heat worked only when it felt like it. I paid my way through community college working closing shifts at a grocery store. Then I transferred on scholarship into a finance program that nobody in my family really understood. By the time I turned 30, I was a senior financial analyst at a Fortune 500 company downtown. The person they trusted when the numbers absolutely had to be right. I spent my life reading spreadsheets. Numbers don't play favorites. Numbers don't lie. I wish I could say the same about people. Daniel and I married when we were 26. We waited to have children, partly because we wanted to, and partly because there was always another family emergency that needed us first. We lived quietly below our means. 2 incomes, 1 used car, no debt. That's the only reason what happened next was even possible. For 9 years. I had quietly sent my parents $4,500 every single month. I never told anyone the amount. Not my husband. Not my sister. Not a single soul. I convinced myself it was helping pay my father's medical bills and their mortgage. I told myself I was simply the only steady person in the family. Somewhere along the way, being the steady one became my entire identity. That responsibility became my identity. I'm telling you this so you'll understand something important. I wasn't naive. I was responsible to the point of erasing myself. There's a difference. And that night, lying in a hospital bed, I finally understood it. The first thing I did wasn't revenge. The first thing I did was solve the immediate problem. Because that's what I'd always done. Using my left thumb, I called the licensed overnight newborn care agency Daniel, and I had carefully researched before Nora was born but never needed to use. A woman answered on the second ring. In 9 calm sentences, I gave her my name, explained the situation, and provided our address. I need a night nurse for my 6-week-old daughter, I said. Starting immediately. She asked one question. Is the baby medically stable? She's perfect, I replied. I'm the one in the hospital. 40 minutes later, a nurse named Yvette let herself into our house using the security code Daniel had provided. She washed her hands, settled in with Nora, and texted me a photo. My daughter was asleep, her tiny fist tucked gently against her cheek. I stared at that picture for a long time. The emergency room nurse standing beside my bed watched me quietly set the phone down. Do you have family who can come? She asked gently. It's handled, I answered. Next. She blinked. People always do when you don't give them the breakdown they're expecting. I wasn't being cold. I was triaging. When you've spent your entire life being the only responsible adult in a room full of adults, that's what you learn to do. My daughter was safe. She was warm. She was being cared for. My husband was already on his way home. My ribs would heal. There was only one item left on my list. One burden I had carried for 9 years without ever allowing myself to examine it too closely. Now my left hand was free. And my mind had never been clearer. I opened my banking app. The login screen glowed in the dark hospital bay like a small, cold moon. Inside the app was a tab labeled Recurring Transfers. There were 4 scheduled payments. I knew every one of them by heart, the way you know the shape of an old scar. The first, Mom and Dad, $2,000 per month. The second, Home Mortgage, $1,100 per month. The third, Dad Medical, $900 per month. The fourth simply read, Megan Support, $500 per month. Every month. A total of $4,500. Month after month. For 108 consecutive months. I had created the very first transfer when I was 25, the night my father called me crying over a hospital bill. After that, I never let myself calculate the total. Some numbers are doors. Once you walk through them, there's no pretending you never saw what was on the other side. That night, for the first time, I made myself look. The app did the math. Without hesitation. $486,000. Nearly $500,000. One quiet automatic payment at a time. All while my mother told relatives that they managed everything on their own. I tapped cancel on the first recurring transfer. A green check mark appeared. Beneath it were 7 words I'll remember for the rest of my life. Recurring transfer cancelled. I tapped the second. Recurring transfer cancelled. Third. Fourth. 4 taps. Less than 20 seconds. And just like that. 9 years ended the same way a faucet stops running. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel devastated. I felt something stranger. A quiet, almost unsettling clarity. The kind you feel when a spreadsheet finally balances after years of carrying the wrong numbers. As I closed the app, my eyes caught something in my transaction history I'd never bothered to scroll back far enough to see. One line. Buried beneath the payments labeled Dad Medical. It was dated 2 years earlier. Loan M, $40,000. Not my father's surgery. Not a medical emergency. Megan, my sister. I locked my phone and stared into the darkness, listening to the steady rhythm of the heart monitor counting each beat. For the first time in 9 years, I forced myself to sit with the question I had spent my entire adult life avoiding. Why had I done it? The easy answer, the one strangers like to give, is that I was weak. That I was a pushover. That I was desperate to be loved. They're wrong. And if you've ever been the dependable one in your family, you already know why. I did it because, somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that being needed was the same as being safe. If I became the load-bearing wall, no one could ever tear the house down without losing me too. My grandmother understood that long before I did. Her name was Ruth. She was my mother's mother. Unshakable. Always smelling faintly of coffee and machine oil. And she never once had to raise her voice to command a room. The year before she passed away, Ruth took my hand at Thanksgiving and said, "Someone has to watch this family's money, and your mother won't. That means it has to be you." At the time I thought she meant be generous. Looking back now, I realize she meant something very different. Be vigilant. Ruth passed away quietly in her sleep last spring. I was so consumed with a difficult pregnancy and a demanding quarter at work that I never stopped to ask what she had left behind, or who she had left it to. I simply assumed my mother had handled everything, just as I assumed my money had been paying for my father's medical care. I had spent my entire life believing the best about people who had never once earned that trust, and I called that belief love. Lying in that hospital bed, with my 6-week-old daughter 40 minutes away in the careful hands of a stranger, I finally understood something that changed everything. I hadn't been supporting my family. I had been supporting a story about my family. The real family had just chosen a cat over my newborn daughter. A little later, Daniel called again during his layover. This time, he repeated every word my mother had said because he knew I would want the exact conversation. He had called her at 9 o'clock, explained that I was in surgery, and begged her to make the 20-minute drive to stay with Nora. He said she let out one of those long, theatrical sighs she always used before refusing someone. She told him she simply couldn't. Megan was finally enjoying her dream vacation, and someone had to stay home and watch the cat. Then she added the sentence that I don't think I'll ever forget. Paige always lands on her feet. And then, almost as an afterthought, she said, "Your sister never has these emergencies." As if the truck that ran the red light had checked my place in the family before crashing into me. As if my daughter's very first night without her mother could simply wait until Megan's cruise was over. Daniel's voice cracked as he repeated those words to me. I told him to breathe. I told him Nora was safe. I told him I was going to be okay. And I told him to get on his plane. After we hung up, I opened Instagram, something I almost never do. At the top of my feed was Megan's latest story. A sparkling turquoise pool. A coconut drink balanced beside a lounge chair. Bright sunshine. A caption that read, "Living my best life, finally." My 29-year-old sister, an aspiring influencer with 11,000 followers and a $500 monthly allowance she genuinely believed came from the universe. I didn't leave a comment. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Instead, I opened my messages and typed 3 simple words to a contact I almost never used. Grandpa H. We should talk. The typing indicator appeared almost instantly, as though he had been waiting 9 years for that message. Maybe he had. I expected Grandpa Harold to reply with a text. Instead, my phone lit up with a FaceTime call. Not from him. From the middle of the Caribbean Sea. It was Megan. I answered with my left hand, my face half hidden in the shadows. She didn't notice the hospital ceiling above me. She didn't notice the cast wrapped around my arm. She didn't even ask why I was lying in bed. If you'd like, I can rewrite the next section 11:22 onward, in the same polished YouTube storytelling style. Lying in a hospital bed just before midnight, I answered the call. "Paige, finally," Megan said, holding the phone so close that all I could see was her sunburned nose. My card got declined at the spa. It was like, so embarrassing. I didn't say a word. As always, she rushed in to fill the silence herself. Mom said the family account always covers me. Did you change something? And just like that, the entire lie revealed itself in a single sentence. The family account. Megan genuinely believed her $500 monthly allowance came from some magical family fund, a shared account our mother managed for everyone's benefit. She had no idea the money came directly from me. For 9 years, my mother had made sure she never found out. Keeping my voice calm, I asked, "Do you even know I was in a car accident?" There was a brief pause. "Wait. What?" she said. "Are you being dramatic right now?" Behind her, a steel drum band burst into music. Can you just fix the card? We dock in Cozumel tomorrow and I have a photo shoot. Photo shoot? I told her I'd look into it, which technically was true. Then I told her I had to go. That was true too. I ended the call before she could say another word and lay back in the darkness, the sound of those steel drums still echoing in my ears. The truth was, Megan wasn't cruel. Not exactly. She was something that felt almost worse. She was someone who had never been asked to imagine that the well could run dry, because no one had ever allowed her to see who had been carrying the bucket all those years. The next morning I was moved to a regular hospital room. That's when my phone began vibrating non-stop on the tray beside my bed. The notifications were coming from our family group chat, Reynolds family, a thread with a dozen relatives in it. Mostly quiet, mostly aunts. I almost never opened it. But the screen kept lighting up, and against my better judgment, I tapped the conversation. My mother had been busy. An hour earlier she had posted a long message that began, "I'm heartbroken to say that Paige is being dramatic again and has cut off her struggling parents out of spite." She went on to describe my father's fragile health, reminding everyone how much they had sacrificed for me. She claimed she had no idea how they would afford his medication now. And then, for the benefit of her audience, she added, "We've always managed." Send the next section, and I'll continue rewriting it in the same high-quality YouTube storytelling style. 1 inch. We've always managed on our own, but this is cruel. There it was again. The same lie. Only this time it wasn't glowing from my banking app. It was glowing from a stage my mother had built. We've always managed on our own. She had been repeating that sentence to friends and relatives for 9 years while quietly depositing my transfers on the 1st of every month. Aunt Carol had already replied with 3 broken heart emojis. "Shame on her," she wrote. "Kicking a sick man while he's already down." One of my cousins followed with praying hands. Not a single person in that group chat knew the truth. Because the truth had never been invited into the room. I stared at the screen and felt an old instinct rise inside me, the urge to explain myself, to soften the situation, to make everyone feel better. It was the same instinct that had kept me carrying everyone else's burdens for years. I turned my phone face down. Explaining belonged to the old version of me. The woman who woke up after that truck accident wanted something different, something colder, something more precise. She wanted the numbers to speak for themselves. And I knew exactly where to find them. The next morning, around 11, Daniel walked into my hospital room. He looked exhausted. His beard had grown in, his clothes were wrinkled, and his face had that gray, worn-out look people get after surviving on fear instead of sleep. He carried Nora in her car seat with one arm and a diaper bag over his shoulder. He had flown home, relieved Yvette at the house, and driven straight to the hospital. Without saying a word, he placed the car seat beside my bed and looked at me, at the cast, at the bruises spreading across my jaw. His eyes immediately filled with tears. "Don't," I whispered, "because if you start, I will too, and I still have work to do." He nodded, carefully lifted Nora from her car seat, and laid her gently across my chest, mindful of my broken ribs. For one quiet minute, the 3 of us simply breathed together. Looking back, that was the only part of that entire week I would willingly live through again. Then my phone rang. It was my father, Roy Reynolds, 64 years old. The man whose medical bills I believed I had been paying for the last 9 years. His voice sounded thin, fragile, almost frightened. "Paigey," he said, the childhood nickname he hadn't used since I was a little girl. "Hi." I didn't know it had gotten this bad. The money. The accident. I didn't know. For one suspended heartbeat, I believed he was finally going to do it. I believed he was finally going to stand up for me. "I never wanted you carrying all of this," he said. Then I heard him take a slow breath, the kind a person takes just before making a life-changing decision. Before he could say another word, I heard my mother's voice in the background. Whoa. Demanding to know who he was talking to. The line went muffled. A hand had covered the phone. When he came back, his voice had changed completely. Flat, careful, defeated. "I should go," he said quietly. "Feel better." Then he hung up. That single phone call summed up my father perfectly. He was a good man who had spent 40 years learning that, in his own house, the safest thing he could do was absolutely nothing. Later that afternoon, Daniel brought me my laptop and set it on the rolling hospital table. Then I did the one thing that has never failed to steady my hands. I opened Excel. With my left hand and a great deal of patience, I exported 9 years of bank statements and dropped every transaction into a pivot table. This is what I do for a multibillion-dollar company. I can certainly do it for my own life. I sorted the entire $486,000 by where the money had actually gone. Cell by cell, the truth began to assemble itself. And it looked nothing like the story my mother had been telling our relatives. The mortgage payments I believed I had been covering. Over 9 years, only 10 payments had actually gone toward the house. Not the 108 I thought I had been funding. My father's legitimate medical expenses, the cardiology visits, prescriptions, and documented treatments, totaled roughly $65,000 over the entire 9-year period. So where had the remaining $421,000 gone? I filtered the transactions by withdrawal location and date. Almost immediately, a pattern emerged. Hundreds of cash withdrawals. Small amounts. Consistent. Nearly every one of them came from within a 2-mile radius of the same zip code. Opened a map. The zip code belonged to Black Hawk. My mother hadn't simply skipped her granddaughter that one night because she happened to be at a casino. She had been visiting that casino for the better part of a decade, using my money, while telling friends and family that she and my father managed everything on their own. Then I noticed a second trail. Smaller, steadier, purposeful. Year after year I followed it. Every transaction led to the same person. Megan. I leaned back as far as my broken ribs would allow and let the numbers tell the story. Because numbers, unlike my family, had never lied to me. I want you to see those numbers the same way I did, because everything that happened afterward depended on them. Out of $486,000, $65,000 could be verified as legitimate medical expenses for my father. $11,000 had actually gone toward the mortgage. That left approximately $410,000 completely unaccounted for. And that money split into 2 very clear rivers. The first river, roughly $290,000 over 9 years, had been withdrawn as cash in small, respectable amounts near Black Hawk, carefully structured so no single transaction would ever raise suspicion. The second river flowed directly to Megan. Nearly $120,000 in total. That included the mysterious $40,000 transaction labeled Loan M, deliberately hidden under my father's medical expenses, the one category I never thought to question. It wasn't a medical loan at all. It had funded my sister's influencer lifestyle. A year of personal brand building. Leased SUV. Professional photographer in Tulum. And not a single dollar had ever been repaid. I printed the entire summary onto one page using the hospital units printer. One clean sheet of paper. 9 years of financial history reduced to 12 simple rows. Then Daniel showed me something else. While scrolling through the family group chat, he had taken a screenshot of a message my mother had sent Aunt Carol long before any of this happened. It read, "We covered Megan's brand ourselves. That's what good parents do. We paid for it ourselves." I looked at that screenshot. Then I looked back at my spreadsheet. Something inside me became incredibly still. Not angry. Not emotional. Just certain. I wasn't going to send an angry message. I wasn't going to defend myself. I wasn't going to explain anything. I was simply going to let the paperwork enter the room. The same room where my mother had spent 9 years performing for an audience. Then I was going to walk away. And never finance the performance again. "It's handled," I told Daniel. For the first time, those words didn't feel like crisis management. They felt like a verdict. I want to pause here for just a moment. If you've made it this far, you might be exactly the person I'm about to describe. For 9 years, I believed I was paying for my father's heart. In reality, I was paying for casino visits and my sister's influencer lifestyle. If you've ever sent money to someone simply because you trusted them, do yourself one favor tonight. Pull up a single bank statement. Just one. Then read it as if it belonged to a complete stranger. Sometimes the truth is easier to recognize when your heart isn't trying to protect it. And if this story is hitting closer to home than you'd like, subscribe. 'Cause what happened next changed everything. The next chapter begins when my grandfather walked through that hospital door. What he said beside my bed shattered everything I thought I knew about my mother. My mother discovered the transfers had stopped the same way she discovered everything else, when it started costing her. The first of the month came and went. No deposit appeared. By noon my phone lit up with her name. I ignored the first call. Then the second. When she called a third time I answered. Avoiding difficult conversations belonged to the old version of me. Her voice arrived sweet as warm apple pie. The voice she reserved for relatives, neighbors and restaurant servers. "Honey, are you okay? We've been so worried about you and the baby." Worried. The woman who had chosen a cat over her granddaughter was suddenly worried. "I'm recovering," I said. "Thank you." There was a brief pause. I could almost hear her adjusting her strategy. Then the warmth slowly disappeared, replaced by a tone I had heard my entire life. "I noticed the money didn't come through this month," she said. "Was there some kind of problem with the bank?" "It wasn't the bank," I replied calmly. Silence. Then, right on schedule, came the guilt. "After everything your father and I have done for you, we took you to every practice. We kept a roof over your head." I let her keep talking. She always followed the same script. She circled back to the one weapon that had never failed her before. Her voice softened, almost wounded, as though I were the one hurting her. "You know," she whispered, "your sister never has these emergencies." There it was. The third time I had heard that sentence in 3 days. Only this time. I didn't flinch. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I simply answered, "I know, Mom." And I let those words carry a meaning she never intended. Megan never had emergencies. I want to pause here for just a moment. If you've stayed with me this far, you might recognize yourself in what I'm about to say. For 9 years, I believed I was paying for my father's heart treatments. In reality, I was financing casino trips and my sister's influencer lifestyle. If you've ever sent money out of love without asking questions, do yourself one favor tonight. Pull up a single bank statement and read it as if it belonged to a stranger. Numbers don't care about excuses. They simply tell the truth. If this story feels painfully familiar, stay with me because what happened next changed everything. 3 hours after I canceled those transfers, my grandfather walked into my hospital room carrying a worn leather folder. The words he spoke that day shattered every lie my mother had built over the last decade. My mother discovered the missing transfers the same way she discovered everything else, when it finally affected her. The first of the month came and went. No deposit arrived. By noon my phone was lighting up with her name. I ignored the first 2 calls. When she called a third time I answered. Not because I wanted to talk, but because avoidance belonged to the old version of me. Her voice floated through the speaker, warm as fresh pie. "Honey, are you all right? We've been worried sick about you." "And the baby?" "Worried sick." This was the same woman who had chosen a cat over her newborn granddaughter. "I'm recovering," I replied. "Thank you." There was a pause. I could almost hear her adjusting her strategy. Then the sweetness began to sour. "I noticed the money didn't come through this month. Was there some kind of banking mistake?" "No," I answered. "There wasn't." Silence. Then right on cue came the guilt. "After everything your father and I sacrificed for you. After every practice we drove you to. After keeping a roof over your head." I let her speak. She always circled back to the same weapon. Softly now, almost wounded, she whispered, "You know, your sister never has these emergencies." It was the third time I'd heard that sentence in 3 days. Only this time. I didn't flinch. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I simply answered, "I know, Mom." And I let those words carry a meaning she would never understand. Megan never had emergencies. 'Cause Megan always had me. Now she had declined credit cards, a leased SUV she couldn't afford, and a life built on money that had quietly disappeared. "I have to feed the baby," I said. Then, for the first time in 34 years, I hung up on my mother while she was still talking. When guilt fails, my family always sends reinforcements. That afternoon, Aunt Carol texted me directly. She'd only done that twice in my adult life, and both times she'd been asking me to donate money for some fundraiser. This message was different. It dripped with borrowed outrage. "I'm disgusted with you. Your parents are barely surviving, your father is sick, and you cut them off. Your grandmother would be ashamed. Family takes care of family." I read it twice. The sentence about Grandma Ruth almost reached me. She was the only person in that family whose opinion had ever truly mattered. Then I remembered her actual words. "Someone has to watch this family's money. Because your mother won't." Suddenly, I realized Aunt Carol had the story completely backward. So I didn't argue. I didn't send paragraphs. I didn't apologize. Instead, I attached a single page. 12 rows. 9 years. Every dollar accounted for. Below it, I typed one sentence. "Here's where the money your sister-in-law claims she managed on her own actually went. The Black Hawk withdrawals belonged to her." Oscar. Then I put my phone down, picked up Nora, and changed her diaper one-handed. The phone buzzed once. Carol was typing. The little 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. No reply. Not that afternoon. Not that evening. Not the next day. I imagined her sitting in her kitchen, staring at those 12 rows of numbers. Because that's the thing about a spreadsheet. You can accuse a person of being emotional. You can call them dramatic. You can question their motives. But you cannot argue with a column of withdrawals. It simply exists. Quietly telling the truth. 4 years, I'd spent every ounce of energy managing everyone else's emotions. It had never occurred to me that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is place the truth on the table and walk away. My mother was many things, but she was never out of moves. When kindness failed, and guilt failed, and Aunt Carol failed, she reached for the stage she controlled best. She announced a family dinner. The invitation arrived in the Reynolds family group chat, wrapped in her usual performance. "Let's all gather Sunday to welcome baby Nora and clear the air as a family. Paige, I hope you'll come so we can put this misunderstanding behind us." A misunderstanding. 5 days after choosing a cat over my newborn daughter. She called it a misunderstanding. Daniel read the message over my shoulder. "You don't have to go," he said quietly. "We can stay home with Nora and let them deal with the consequences." He was right. I didn't have to go. But I knew exactly what Sunday really was. It wasn't about meeting my daughter. It wasn't about healing the family. It was about getting me into a room full of relatives, pressuring me, shaming me, until I turned the money back on. She wanted an audience for my surrender. So I decided to give her the audience. Just not the surrender. I replied with only 2 words. "Will come." And in that moment, the trap quietly closed around the person who built it. Before Sunday arrived, I made one more call. Grandpa Harold answered on the second ring. We talked for 40 minutes. At the very end, in his dry gravel voice, he asked me one question. "Do you want this handled quietly? Or do you want the truth?" I looked down at Nora sleeping peacefully in the crook of my good arm. At the tiny life I'd nearly sacrificed while funding a lie. "The truth," I answered. There was a long pause. Then Grandpa spoke. "Good. I'll bring the folder." I never asked what was inside. Some part of me already knew. Because deep down, I understood that whatever rested inside that worn folder was finally going to end this story forever. But before we get to Sunday, we have to go back just a few hours. Back to the night of the accident. Because exactly 3 hours after I canceled those 4 recurring transfers. 3 hours after I canceled those transfers, while Daniel was still somewhere above the Rockies, my hospital room door opened. Grandpa Harold stepped inside. 78 years old. My mother's father. He wore the same pressed flannel shirt he always wore to church, buttoned neatly to the collar. He leaned on a cane with obvious reluctance, as if accepting help from anything, even wood, still offended him. "I had to call both hospitals before I found you," he said quietly. "Your mother told me you'd only been in a little fender bender." His eyes settled on the cast wrapped around my arm, the bruises spreading across my jaw, and the tubes running from my chest. I drove past 3 exits before I admitted she'd lied. Under one arm he carried a thick manila folder. The corners were worn soft with age. 2 faded rubber bands barely held it together. He laid it gently at the foot of my bed, almost like he was placing evidence before a judge. Then he lowered himself into the vinyl chair beside me, folded both hands over the top of his cane, and said the sentence that would echo in my mind for the rest of my life. I knew. I stared at him. Knew what? He looked at the folder instead of me. About the money. All 9 years of it. About where your mother's been spending her afternoons. About the stories she's been telling this family while you've been bleeding yourself dry. His fingers tapped the folder once. But not tonight. You've carried enough for one night. We'll do this properly. In front of everyone. So she can't slip away from the truth. I understood immediately. Some truths only matter when they're spoken in a room full of witnesses. Before he left that evening, Grandpa gave me just enough information so I wouldn't walk into Sunday blind. He told me the story no one else ever had. Grandma Ruth hadn't simply drifted away peacefully. Not really. During the final year of her life, she'd started noticing things. The expensive car. The casino trips. The sudden shopping sprees. Money that appeared from nowhere. She stopped accepting easy answers. One evening she cornered Harold in the kitchen and said, "Someone is keeping Linda afloat, and it isn't us. Find out who." So he did. It wasn't easy. The bank refused to discuss accounts with him. But Harold had spent 40 years balancing the books for a cattle operation. He knew how numbers behaved. And numbers always leave tracks. Eventually, those tracks led straight to me. 9 years. $486,000. A granddaughter quietly wiring away every spare dollar she earned. While her mother dug the hole even deeper. Grandma Ruth wanted to stop it herself. She simply ran out of time. So she did the next best thing, Harold said. I leaned forward. What does that mean? He shook his head. Sunday. You'll understand on Sunday. Then he gave me one final piece. Before your grandmother died, she spent months meeting with an attorney. Everything she wanted protected. Everything she wanted exposed. It was put in writing. It carries both our signatures. And a lawyer in Boulder believes it'll hold. He rested one hand on the folder. In Colorado, a properly written trust says exactly what it's meant to say. And your grandmother made sure hers did. He stood slowly, picked up the folder, then paused at the doorway. Paige. Whatever your mother says on Sunday, your grandmother was never ashamed of you. She trusted you. With everything. That's why she chose you. Then he walked out, leaving me alone with more questions than answers. I didn't sleep at all that night. The afternoon before the family dinner, Grandpa came by the house to check on me. Daniel made coffee. Nora slept upstairs. For the first time in my life, I asked the question that had haunted me since childhood. Why Megan? Why was she always enough? And I never was. Harold sat quietly for a long moment, turning his coffee mug between both hands. Finally he sighed. You have to understand your mother before you can understand what she did. I braced myself, because I loved Grandma Ruth. I didn't want someone to rewrite who she had been. Your grandmother was a hard woman, he began. Fair. Most of the time. But hard. And she had a favorite. It wasn't your mother. It was your Uncle Danny. God rest him. He looked down into his coffee. Linda grew up being the dependable one. The responsible one. The daughter expected to carry everything. While Danny got the praise. The words landed harder than I expected. 'Cause I knew that role. I'd lived it myself. Harold continued. When you were born, you turned out exactly like your mother had been. Quiet. Responsible. Reliable. The child who never demanded anything. He looked directly at me. And something inside Linda couldn't bear seeing herself again. Then his voice softened. When Megan came along, she was loud, emotional, needy. Everything your mother never had permission to be. For the first time in her life, Linda got to become the mother of the favorite, instead of the forgotten daughter. He rubbed the rim of his cup with his thumb. She gave Megan everything she'd spent her own childhood wishing someone had given her. He met my eyes again. That doesn't excuse what she did. It only explains the shape of it. I sat there without speaking. Because suddenly my mother wasn't just a villain anymore. She was a wounded child. Who had grown into a woman determined to rewrite her own story, even if it meant forcing her oldest daughter to live the childhood she'd hated most. The tragedy wasn't that she'd been hurt. The tragedy was that instead of ending the cycle, she handed it to me. The pattern hadn't ended with my mother. She had inherited it. Then passed it on to me. And she crowned my sister as the favorite she had always wanted to be. Grandpa looked down at his coffee before speaking again. The casino, he said quietly, was the only place your mother ever believed she could win something without spending her whole life earning it by being useful. I understood her. Maybe more than anyone else ever could. And I still knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done. That night, lying awake beside Nora's bassinet, I decided exactly what Sunday would be. And more importantly, what it would never become. It would not be a shouting match. I had watched my mother win 1,000 arguments by raising her voice. She was an artist when it came to turning volume into victory. The moment I shouted back, I would become exactly who she needed me to be. The emotional, ungrateful, unstable daughter. With a room full of relatives ready to confirm her version of events. I wasn't going to give her that. I wasn't going to fight with noise. I was going to answer with paper. That was the difference between us. My mother's weapons had always been the same. Warm lies. Perfectly timed guilt. Stories carefully performed for an audience that never questioned the script. Mine were much simpler. One printed spreadsheet. One screenshot on Daniel's phone. One worn folder in Grandpa Harold's hands. She would speak. I would present evidence. She would perform. I would let the facts speak for themselves. She dealt in emotion. I dealt in numbers. And this time, the numbers would have witnesses. That evening, Daniel found me sitting at the kitchen table while Nora slept upstairs. I'm not going to argue with her, I told him. I'm going to walk in, place the truth on the table, and let the documents do the talking. He studied me for a moment. Are you sure you can stay calm? You know your mother. Smiled. Not because I was happy. 'Cause I finally understood something. I've been calm my entire life, I said. I've just spent most of it being silent. They aren't the same thing. Somewhere between the accident, the hospital, the cancelled transfers, and Grandpa's worn folder, I'd finally learned the difference. Silence protects the lie. Calm reveals the truth. I folded the printed summary into thirds and slipped it into Nora's diaper bag beneath a pack of baby wipes. The safest place in the house was the one nobody would think to search. Megan flew home from her Caribbean cruise on Saturday. She called from the airport. The conversation told me everything I needed to know about how differently we'd lived the same week. Okay, she sighed dramatically. The cruise was basically ruined. She said it before saying hello, before asking how I was, before asking about Nora. I spent the entire trip stressed because my card kept getting declined. I stayed quiet. She mistook my silence for agreement. Mom said you had some kind of meltdown and turned off the family account. I mean, fine. Have your feelings. But I've got a launch coming up. I literally can't function without that money. So could you just fix it before dinner tomorrow? So we don't have to make this into a whole thing. Fix it. As though nearly dying. As though abandoning my newborn daughter. As though 9 years of deception were nothing more than a clogged drain inconveniencing her schedule. I looked down at Nora sleeping peacefully beside me. Then I asked one simple question. Megan, where do you think that money comes from? Silence. A real silence. Longer than any she'd ever given me. Finally she answered. Mom and Dad. But her voice lifted at the end. Not a statement. Question disguised as certainty. The first crack I'd ever heard in the story she'd been raised to believe. It's just family money. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. I'll see you tomorrow. Then I ended the call. Because there are some truths people have to discover themselves. No explanation could have prepared her for what she was about to learn. The woman who had quietly funded her entire adult life. The woman whose money had paid for the influencer dreams. The leased SUV. The luxury vacations. And the expensive photo shoots. Wasn't our parents. It was me. And by this time tomorrow, she would discover that truth in front of every relative who had spent years applauding the wrong performance. No declined credit card could compare to what was coming. Sunday afternoon finally arrived. Daniel drove. Nora slept peacefully in her car seat. The diaper bag rested beside me. Inside it, a single folded page waited quietly beneath a package of baby wipes. We pulled into my parents' driveway. The same driveway. The same house. The same mortgage I'd believed I was faithfully helping to pay for nearly a decade. Daniel parked the car. Neither of us moved. For one long moment. I simply sat there, hands resting in my lap, taking one slow breath after another. Because once I walked through that front door, nothing in my family would ever be the same again. I sat in the car for a long moment before opening the door. The cast was still wrapped around my right arm. The hospital ID bracelet still circled my wrist, faded now after 5 days. Its white plastic softened from showers and restless nights. Kept it on intentionally. Slowly I peeled it away. Not because I wanted to forget. Because I wanted to remember. I folded the bracelet carefully and slipped it into my coat pocket. A small piece of plastic. A quiet reminder of exactly where I'd been the night my mother chose a cat over her granddaughter. Daniel lifted Nora's car seat from the back seat. From somewhere behind us came the familiar tap. 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 Of Grandpa Harold's cane. He walked toward us wearing his Sunday flannel, the same worn manila folder tucked securely beneath his arm, held together by 2 faded rubber bands that looked almost as old as the secrets inside. He had insisted on arriving separately. I don't want your mother seeing us come together, he'd said. I'd rather she doesn't have time to prepare. He stopped beside me on the porch. You ready? Through the front window I could already see them. Aunt Carol. 2 cousins. My father sitting quietly in his usual chair. My mother moving gracefully through the room, pouring coffee with practiced warmth, smiling at everyone as though she were hosting Thanksgiving instead of staging an intervention. The queen of a kingdom. Built with money she'd never earned. Megan sat on the arm of the sofa, scrolling through her phone, still wearing the faint sunburn from her Caribbean vacation. Completely unaware that her entire world was about to shift. Took one slow breath. I'm ready. And for the first time in my life. I actually meant it. Grandpa pushed the front door open with the tip of his cane. Together we stepped inside. 3 generations my mother never wanted standing together. A newborn baby. Hospital cast. a folded ID bracelet in my pocket, and one worn folder full of truth. The conversation died instantly. Every face turned toward us. My mother spun around, coffee pot still in her hand, her welcoming smile already perfectly arranged. The performance began the moment she saw us. I'll give my mother one thing. She always knew how to make an entrance. She set the coffee pot down, pressed one hand dramatically against her chest, then hurried toward Nora, her eyes already shining with carefully prepared tears. "Oh, there's my precious granddaughter." She reached for the baby. Daniel stepped sideways. Not aggressively, not rudely, just enough to move the car seat beyond her reach. Her extended arms paused awkwardly in the air. For a split second, the mask slipped. Then she recovered. She always recovered. She turned away from Nora and toward the audience. "I'm just so relieved we're finally all together," she sighed. "This has been the hardest week of my life. The hardest week of her life. Not mine. Not the woman who had spent 5 days recovering from broken ribs and a punctured lung. Not the newborn who'd spent her first night without her mother. No. Apparently the hardest week belonged to the woman who had declined to drive 20 minutes because she was watching a cat. She continued flawlessly. She told everyone I'd been in a little accident, that I'd used it as an excuse, that I'd cruelly abandoned my struggling parents, that she'd spent sleepless nights wondering what had happened to her daughter. She dabbed delicately at the corners of her eyes. Exactly on cue. Around the room, heads nodded sympathetically. Except not everyone. Aunt Carol kept glancing down. She couldn't quite meet my eyes anymore. I knew why. Somewhere in her purse, or on her kitchen table, was the spreadsheet I'd sent. 12 rows. 9 years. Facts don't disappear just because someone cries louder. My father stared silently into his folded hands. Megan finally looked up from her phone. She seemed confused, like she'd walked into the middle of a play without receiving her script. Then my mother delivered the line that had worked for 3 decades. She turned toward me. Eyes wet, voice trembling, perfectly pitched for every relative in the room. "I just don't understand where this cruelty came from." Then she said it again. The sentence she'd repeated 4 times in less than a week. The sentence she'd used to justify abandoning my daughter. "Your sister never has these emergencies." Silence. She had no idea, not the slightest idea, that she'd just handed me the very evidence that would destroy her story. The room waited. They expected tears. Or shouting. Maybe another apology. Instead, I calmly reached into Nora's diaper bag, slipped my hand beneath the baby wipes, and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. I didn't stand. I didn't make a speech. I unfolded the page slowly, smoothed it flat against my thigh with my good hand, then placed it gently in the center of the dining table beneath the overhead light. One piece of paper. 12 rows. 9 years. No opinions. No accusations. Just numbers. Then I looked directly at my mother and spoke in the same calm voice I use every quarter when presenting financial reports. "You're right, Mom. Megan never has these emergencies." Pause. Because now, every eye in the room belonged to me. And today, they're finally going to understand why. Then my phone rang. It was my father. His voice sounded weak. "Paige." He used the childhood nickname he hadn't spoken in years. I didn't know. About the money. About the accident. I didn't know. For one brief moment, I believed he might finally stand up for himself. "I never wanted you carrying all of this," he whispered. Then I heard my mother's voice in the background asking who he was talking to. The line became muffled. When he returned, his courage had disappeared. "I should go. Feel better." Then he hung up. That single phone call explained my father better than 30 years ever had. He wasn't an evil man. He was simply a good man who had spent decades learning that survival inside that house meant staying silent. Later that afternoon, Daniel brought me my laptop. For the first time since the accident, my hands felt steady. I did the one thing I trusted more than anything else. I built a spreadsheet. Using only my left hand, I downloaded 9 years of bank statements and imported every transaction into a pivot table. This was what I did every day for a Fortune 500 company. Surely I could do it for my own life. The truth appeared one cell at a time. The mortgage I believed I had been paying for 9 straight years had actually received only 10 payments, not 108. My father's legitimate medical expenses, including surgeries, prescriptions, and cardiology visits, totaled only about $65,000. So where had the remaining $421,000 gone? I filtered the transactions by location. One zip code dominated the screen. Black Hawk. Hundreds of cash withdrawals. Small amounts, always near the casino, year after year. Another trail led somewhere else. Megan. The numbers didn't need emotions. They didn't need opinions. They simply existed. Out of the $486,000 I had sent over 9 years, $65,000 paid for my father's real medical care. $11,000 actually went toward the mortgage. Nearly $290,000 disappeared through casino area cash withdrawals. Around $120,000 funded Megan's lifestyle, including a hidden $40,000 transfer disguised as my father's surgery. That money had paid for branding packages, leased SUV, professional photography sessions in Tulum. I printed the entire 9-year history onto one clean page. 12 rows. One sheet of paper. 9 years of truth. Then Daniel handed me one final screenshot. It showed a message my mother had once sent Aunt Carol. We paid for Megan's brand ourselves. That's what good parents do. I looked at that screenshot. Then I looked at my spreadsheet. And something inside me became perfectly still. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to defend myself. I was simply going to place the truth in front of the same audience my mother had been performing for all these years. Then I would walk away. Forever. It's handled, I told Daniel. For the first time, those words didn't sound like damage control. They sounded like a verdict. The moment my grandfather finished speaking, the room fell silent. No one looked at me anymore. Every eye turned toward my mother. People always imagine this is the moment when someone finally apologizes. It almost never is. I wish someone had warned me of that before I walked into the room. My mother didn't say she was sorry. Instead, she tried everything except the truth. First came the tears. Loud, sudden, practiced. She cried the way she always had whenever reality cornered her. But this time, the room didn't rush to comfort her. When the tears failed, she turned toward my father. Roy, are you really going to let them do this to me? Then she added quietly, this was your mess too. The surgery. All of it. My father flinched. For one brief second, I saw the same man I had almost heard on the phone from the hospital. He slowly raised his head and looked at me. His lips parted. For one hopeful heartbeat, I believed this was the moment he would finally choose the truth over fear. Paige is right, he whispered. Linda. The casino. You know it's been. He never finished. My mother's eyes snapped toward him with a look that had been perfected over 40 years of marriage. The words died in his throat. His shoulders slumped. He lowered his eyes back to his hands. And that was the last thing my father ever said about the money. In that quiet moment I let him go. Not with anger. Not with hatred. Simply with acceptance. Some people spend their entire lives surviving instead of living. My father was one of them. With no one left willing to protect her, my mother's grief disappeared almost instantly. The tears dried. The performance ended. What remained was anger. Pure and sharp. You'll regret this, she hissed. I'll fight that trust. I'll hire a lawyer. You can't just steal someone's home. Before I could answer, Grandpa Harold calmly stepped forward. His voice never rose. It was never your home, Linda. It belonged to your mother. He rested one hand on the folder. The paperwork is clean. Trusts like this rarely fail in court. He paused before adding one honest word. Almost. Even then, he refused to promise what no honest lawyer ever could. Across the room, Megan had begun crying. Not the dramatic tears our mother performed. Real ones. For the first time in her life, she understood that the money had not appeared by magic. Every vacation, every shopping trip, every monthly allowance, every luxury, had been standing on someone else's sacrifice. And that someone was me. I quietly gathered my single sheet of paper. My work was finished. There was only one thing left to do. I stood carefully, my broken ribs refusing to let me move too quickly. Daniel handed me Nora's car seat. I held it gently against my side. Then I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the faded gray hospital wristband I had worn for 5 days. I didn't explain it. I didn't make a speech. I simply wrapped it once around the handle of my daughter's car seat and let it hang there. A small worn piece of plastic. Holy, ordinary, perfect. Because that little hospital band told the entire story. The night I nearly died. My family checked a cruise schedule. Behind me my mother was still talking. Threats had already turned into pleading. Paige, honey, we can fix this. We're family. But her voice no longer reached me. It faded behind me like music you stop hearing the moment you walk out of the room. I turned toward Aunt Carol. She had gone pale. She looked smaller somehow. Quiet. I offered her a gentle smile. Here's how everything settled, because I know that's the question people always ask. The trust held. My mother contacted 2 different attorneys, hoping someone would find a way around it. Both gave her the same answer. The paperwork was airtight. My grandparents had signed every document while fully competent, and the trust had been created exactly as the law required. Challenging it would be expensive, unlikely to succeed, and almost certainly pointless. After that, the threats quietly disappeared. My parents still live in the house. The trust allows them to remain there for the rest of their lives, and I never wanted to put an aging man with a failing heart out on the street, no matter how much his silence had cost me. But one thing changed forever. The casino was no longer funded by my paycheck. Without fresh money flowing in every month, Black Hawk became exactly what it had always been. A room full of flashing lights feeding on whoever walked through the door. Megan eventually found a real job at a marketing agency. For the first time in her life, her paycheck depended on her own work instead of someone else's sacrifice. The last message she ever sent me came months later. Just 3 words. Where'd it go? I replied with the exact same single-page spreadsheet I had placed on the dining room table that afternoon. She never answered. But she never asked me for money again either. Aunt Carol did exactly what I believed she would. She told the family the truth. Not with drama. Not with gossip. Just the facts. The Reynolds family group chat became unusually quiet after that. Silence has a way of settling over people when there are no lies left to defend. My father still calls me from time to time. Never from home. Always when he's alone in the car. I answer every call. Not because everything has been repaired, but because some relationships don't need to be perfect to deserve a little grace. The night nurse who cared for Nora while I lay in the hospital stayed with us for 2 weeks while my ribs healed. She still mails Nora a birthday card every year. Family, I learned, isn't always the people you share blood with. Sometimes it's simply the people who show up when you need them most. Grandpa Harold eventually sold his house and moved into a small rental just 10 minutes away. Every Sunday he joins us for dinner. And every single visit without fail. He places that old worn folder on my bookshelf before sitting down. Then he smiles and says, "Just in case anyone forgets." No one ever does. If I learned anything from a hospital bed, a faded wristband, an old folder, and 4 taps inside a banking app, it's this. The people who constantly praise you for being the strong one are often the very people who have quietly decided you'll carry every burden they don't want to lift. The moment you stop financing their lives, they'll call you selfish. But sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't carrying everyone else. It's finally putting the weight down. The day I stopped being my family's bank account was the day I finally became what my daughter actually needed. Her mother. Not everyone's caretaker. That's my story. 9 years. Nearly $500,000. One hospital bed. One folder. And the truth my entire family spent years trying to bury. If this story made you think about your own life, let it be a reminder to check the things you've been trusting without question. Read the statement. Ask the difficult question. Pay attention to who shows up when your world falls apart. And if you know someone who's always expected to be the strong one, share this story with them. They may need the reminder that strength was never meant to be a life sentence. Thank you for reading. I'll see you in the next story.